Thank you, Donna. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you again for coming to our, as Donna said, third act of this Jacksonville history course. This is Act 3, Scene 2. There will be a third and final scene next week on the 28th, where we're going to try to bring our history up to through the 21st century and as close to the present day as we can. But before I do that, I want to give you a sense of what we're going to do today. If you were with us last week, you know that we were focused on the period from about 1960 to 1964. And we were talking about the new modern phase of the civil rights movement in this city during that time. And I'll go back over a little bit what we talked about in just a little bit. But what I'm going to do today is move from the civil rights movement to other issues that were gripping the city during really the 50s up through nearly the beginning of the 1970s. And as Donna said, this is part of a Matthew 25 initiative here at Palms that is, of course, prevalent in other PCUSA churches across the country. And it's not just issues of race that Matthew 25 looks at. There are a whole host of issues, as Donna said, related to poverty, related to environmental concerns, and other issues. And so what I want to give us a sense of today are other issues that were really kind of inhibiting Jacksonville's development during the 1950s and 1960s. And then I'm going to argue were a series of crises that the city was increasingly forced to address, and that these crises, as we're going to see, are going to lead to something called consolidation. And we're going to talk about this history of consolidation next week on the 28th. We'll talk about what consolidation was and how the consolidation movement tried to address some of these particular crises that were engulfing Jacksonville and Duval County during the 1950s and 60s. And so these crises are going to be the housing crisis. Jacksonville had an extraordinary number of substandard houses in this city and an incredibly high poverty rate during the 1950s and 60s. This is an issue that in many ways, like these other ones I'm going to discuss today, really have never been completely addressed or rectified, thus making something like a Matthew 25 initiative all the more important so that people within churches and in the community are aware of what exists, particularly outside the bounds of our beaches bubble. So after I discuss the housing crisis, I'm going to talk about an educational crisis. Duval County Public Schools were in crisis during the 1960s, and in fact in 1964, 15 of Duval County's high schools were disaccredited. I see some alumni of Duval County Public Schools in the room right now who nevertheless went on to become very successful people in their lives despite that disaccreditation. So we're going to talk about that public education crisis. And I would argue, and this is from me as a parent of a fourth grader in a Duval County public school, I think our public schools remain in a state of crisis right now, though very different from what existed in the 1960s and 70s. We'll then move and talk about an environmental crisis. During the 1960s, Jacksonville had some of the worst air quality in the nation, rivaling Los Angeles and other northern cities, in addition to western cities like Los Angeles and San Francisco. In addition to that, Jacksonville's river, the St. Johns River, was one of the most polluted rivers in the nation. What had once been one of the richest ecosystems, really not just in North America, but the world, by the 1960s, that ecosystem had become largely unfit for life. And so that, on top of everything else, was something that was holding Jacksonville back from developing. And then on top of all of those things, and again, keeping in mind what we discussed last week, which is the civil rights revolution happening at this very same time, on top of all these other crises, Jacksonville in the 1960s is facing an economic crisis and a political crisis. The city effectively is hurtling towards financial ruin. Its tax base is shrinking, its budget is rising, it cannot provide basic services and infrastructure throughout the city, and on top of that, the government is rife with corruption. Scandal after scandal is becoming widespread in the 1960s that is going to lead to the indictment of public officials. And all of this, when taken together, all of these crises are going to push a movement towards consolidation. And so I'll touch at the very end of today's class by talking about the beginning of this consolidation movement. A movement that on the surface is quite obvious, as the name suggests. It's going to be the consolidation of city and county governments to create the current boundaries of the city of Jacksonville that we know today. That aside from the beaches and Baldwin on the far western half of Duval County, all of Duval County is in effect Jacksonville. Well, consolidation was about simplifying and streamlining government, but it was also a way to create a more effective government to address all these multiple crises that were affecting the city. And again, what I want to leave you with today is, and I'll give away part of what I'll say next week, consolidation doesn't solve all of these problems. If you've been following recently the negotiations about the stadium deal between the city and the Jaguars, you know that part of the money, part of that deal involves investing a lot of money in communities, particularly surrounding the stadium, but throughout Jacksonville, as Mayor Deegan has said, to make the promises of consolidation real. And the reality, of course, then, as we're going to see next week, is that though consolidation did resolve many troubling problems in the city, it left behind a lot of these issues that were very, very prominent in the 1950s and 60s, and that are still very much with us today. And that, in fact, a lot of faith groups in this city are actively, and other nonprofit groups are actively involved in addressing. But I think it's important for us, particularly as we are out here at the beaches, and there's a sense of unreality sometimes when we're at the beach about how other people live throughout our particular area. It's important to keep in mind the historical roots of issues that are very much alive in our city today. All right, so let me jump in and just mention something. I've shown this book in previous classes, but I want to let you know that a lot of what I'm going to be basing my talk on here today is a combination of things. It's research I did for the course at FSCJ that we offer now on the history of Jacksonville, but it is also drawn from this book by a former UNF history professor named Jim Crooks. If you are interested in anything I say today and want to know more about this history, basically from World War II up to the present day, this is the book I would recommend, Jacksonville, The Consolidation Story from Civil Rights to the Jaguars. And you can find this easily on Amazon, or if you prefer, through the University Press of Florida. All right, so I'm going to start here, despite all of these crises I was just alluding to. I want to start with what Jim was here last summer for some of our talks. I don't think he's feeling well enough to come out anymore. But Jim Crooks was someone that I knew as a young kid. He went to Lakewood Presbyterian Church, where I grew up in town. He and my mom worked on UCOM and other social service ventures in the city. So Jim was a really important figure in my youth, and then in my young adulthood, he was sort of a mentor as I moved into graduate school. But in Jim's book that I just showed you, Jim calls the 1950s the decade of progress for Jacksonville. And in many ways, that was true. And one of the things we're going to see today is sort of this contradictory picture of the city. Jacksonville is progressing. It grows by leaps and bounds after World War II. Its business economy is going to boom in the 1950s into the early 1960s. But that is going to be set to one side in distinction to all these other crises that are going on at the same time. And so I want to at least paint a brief picture of the good things that were happening in Jacksonville before we spend the lion's share of our time talking about the not so good. And one of Jim's arguments is that one of the key features in Jacksonville's progress in the 1950s was the development of its expressway system. Up until the 1950s, travelers coming in and out of Jacksonville, oftentimes, whether they're heading north, south, east, or west, had to drive through downtown. And downtown traffic became extraordinarily congested, which was contributing to an air pollution problem, which for other reasons was exacerbated in the 1960s. And in the 1950s, we saw the creation of the Jacksonville Transportation Authority, the JTA. It was initially known as the JEA, the Jacksonville Expressway Authority, and then changed when there was a Jacksonville Electric Authority later in the 1960s. So what did the JTA do? Well, it began to create our modern expressway system, the Arlington Expressway, South Side Expressway, but also here the Myrtle Overpass, this expressway that will later be part of the I-95 interstate system later in the 1950s, that will help circumvent traffic around downtown and allow for easier commuter access to and from the city, and particularly to the suburbs. So the development of infrastructure, particularly the expressway system, but not just the expressway system, also new bridges. In the 1950s, in 1953 to be exact, we have the John E. Matthews Bridge that links Arlington with the east side. In 1954, I believe, the Fuller Warren Bridge connects San Marco with Riverside. And so here is a photograph from 1972, and it's one of the very few I could find where you can see all the bridges in Jacksonville except the Buckman and what is now the Dames Point or the Napoleon Bonaparte Broward Bridge. And so here is the Fuller Warren Bridge. Over that is the Acosta Bridge. Acosta Bridge spanned San Marco and downtown in 1921 for the very first time. As you head further east, that is the John T. Alsop or Main Street Bridge. And then further up there in the right-hand corner, that is the Isaiah Hart Bridge. That's 1967. And then off to the sort of east-northeast, that's the Matthews Bridge. So Jacksonville, and I will just mention briefly, the Buckman Bridge is opened up to traffic, I believe, in 1970. And then the Dames Point or the Broward Bridge in 1989. But really, my point here is to emphasize the Fuller Warren Bridge and the Matthews Bridge as a result of this sort of renaissance in city funding for expressways and new infrastructure that Jim Crooks argues was part of this decade of progress. Now, I'll just mention as an aside, if you followed along local news, national news, you know there has been controversies over the naming of public schools or older names that public schools have had, particularly with Confederate generals. Here in Jacksonville, of course, we had Robert E. Lee, we had Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, we had Kirby Smith, we had Joseph Finnegan. The list goes on and on and on. Now, I'm not here to debate whether or not those schools should have been renamed, but that no one questioned the names of bridges in our city. Because if you scratch beneath the surface and looked at the people who were named, who have their names attached to bridges, almost to a person, I'm thinking of a charitable word here at church, less than noble human beings. And I've always thought it's a reflection of how little people know about Jacksonville history that no one questioned whether or not a bridge should be named after a former Ku Klux Klansman, or a bridge should be named after a man who vehemently believed that black people should be deported from the country and settled somewhere outside so white people never have to interact with them again. Those are some of the people who have bridges named after them today. And the fact that no one brought that up is a reflection of how little people know about our city's history. In addition to this boom in infrastructure, during the 1950s and 1960s, Jacksonville becomes the insurance capital of the Southeast. And this is going to further lead to business growth, the growth of the banking industry as well. In 1953, the state of Florida, Tallahassee legislature, passed a law called the Regional Home Office Act, the Regional Home Office Act. And that was basically a law that said to businesses and corporations, if you establish your southern region home here in Jacksonville or anywhere in Florida, you will get substantial tax benefits and other financial benefits by doing so. And so that meant here in Jacksonville, many insurance companies established their regional headquarters in Jacksonville. Prudential, Independent Life, Gulf Life, that had been in Jacksonville a very long time, nevertheless established their regional headquarters here as well. State Farm also established regional headquarters here, as did Blue Cross Blue Shield. And so the growth of the insurance industry in Jacksonville brought in migration into the city. At the very same time, we see banks in Jacksonville like Barnett Bank, Florida National Bank, Atlantic Bank, providing venture capital to the development of business as well. And so Jim is right when he argues, and these are just two examples here, brief ones but important ones, that the 1950s is seeing Jacksonville really kind of leaving behind its past as a kind of mid-tier southern city and becoming the modern city that we know today. In addition to that, and as I've already alluded, the development of business is going hand in hand with an influx of new residents in the city and changing demographics in the city. So let me give you a portrait of what Jacksonville and Duval County's population looked like during this time. In 1950, Duval County had a population of about 304,000. 15 years later, in 1965, Duval County's population is 525,000. So 15 years later, we are over 500,000 people. This explosive growth in Duval County. What is interesting, though, is the contrast with Jacksonville. So remember, this is before consolidation. So the boundaries, the city boundaries of Jacksonville are much smaller than they are today. But Jacksonville is experiencing the opposite. During this time, 1950 to 1965, Jacksonville lost population. In 1950, Jacksonville has a population of 204,000. By 1965, it has a population of 198,000. So what's going on? Business is booming, people are flocking to the city. Duval County's population is growing by leaps and bounds. Why is Jacksonville's falling? There's a number of reasons for this. One thing I want to draw your attention to is that first image I showed you. When the expressway system and then I-95 is built near downtown, it goes right through, and again, to situate you, if you can see up here, that is Bay Street. If you were going down Bay Street today, you will come up to the Prime Osborne Convention Center, which used to be Union Terminal, the railroad station here in Jacksonville. Just to kind of give you direction. That would be east, that's west, that's north and south. So the I-95 interstate system will plow through the La Villa neighborhood, historically black neighborhood just to the west of downtown. La Villa, as we remember if you were attending the class a while back, we were talking about Reconstruction. La Villa was its own town, it had its own mayor, it had interracial government in the city. Well, it eventually becomes the center of black culture and black business and black neighborhoods in Jacksonville. The creation of the interstate system destroys a substantial part of that neighborhood and other surrounding black neighborhoods. And so where do those residents go when the interstate system is created? Many of them move further to the north and to the west into an area that is in Duval County, but not technically Jacksonville. That becomes a loss of population. In addition, there's something called the Great Migration that is still going on after World War II. Something that began during World War I. That is the movement of Southern black people from southern cities like Jacksonville and rural areas in the South to the north to escape Jim Crow and for better educational and job opportunities. There is still people in the 1950s into the early 1960s leaving Jacksonville to go to northern cities. So part of that is the population loss as a result of those factors. But also population loss is beginning to pick up steam because the creation of the expressway and interstate system is leading to the boom of the suburbs and a phenomenon known as white flight. Now, white flight obscures the fact that it's not just white people who are leaving the city of Jacksonville to the suburbs. There are, as we've seen, some black residents, whether because of eminent domain, losing their houses to the I-95 construction, or for their own reasons, are leaving the city to move further out into Duval County. But all of these factors and particularly new arrivals to the city, find more affordable housing available in the suburbs and prefer to live in the suburbs than in the city. So all of this is leading to the decline of Jacksonville's population. And this is going to be really, really important when we talk about consolidation, because the loss of population in the city means the loss of a tax base. But at the same time, that is tax revenue, the budget cost of Jacksonville boom as the rest of Duval County booms, for reasons that are very complex, but we'll talk about later. And that is going to create this budget crisis that I'll touch on at the very end of class. All right, so let me now move into our first crisis, and that is the housing crisis in Jacksonville. And this is one that I would argue is still very much with us. And so here is sort of the background history, the roots, so to speak, of this ongoing housing crisis in our city. So I've said I was going to begin here in the 50s. I'm going to actually take us back briefly to the 1930s. And I'm going to talk about something called redlining. It might be something that you are familiar with, but if you're not, very, very briefly. During the 1930s, the Great Depression, during the administration of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, sometimes historians call this era the New Deal, Roosevelt and Congress passed a law called the National Housing Act of 1934. And in effect, what the National Housing Act of 1934 did was begin to create programs that allocated money for low-interest mortgage loans and also financial assistance for mortgage payments to keep people homeowners in the United States. But in order to do that, they began to figure out who were risky people to loan to and who were more surefire people to loan to. And they began to argue that what we need to do is to do a kind of geographic analysis of where people lived and who the people were in certain neighborhoods, and to kind of categorize their level of risk in terms of loans. And this led to a practice known as redlining. And a government agency would go into cities and they would look at the demographics of certain neighborhoods and then turn around and determine that level of risk, what they called security. Let me make sure I'm getting this quote right here. Where did my... I must have not have put it there. But basically, these were security level maps. And what you see here is in green, these are the best neighborhoods to loan in. Number 2 or B is still desirable neighborhoods. C, definitely declining neighborhoods. And then D, hazardous neighborhoods, neighborhoods where loans were very rare, if not unheard of. What's important to note here is that black neighborhoods, regardless of whether those neighborhoods had middle class or even upper middle class residents in terms of their income, all black neighborhoods were by definition determined to be hazardous, and therefore home loans were very rare. And these practices were part of a government policy, but they were picked up on by private insurance companies as well, who used similar maps to determine risk and whether or not to give loans. And so the effects of this are going to be quite obvious. Home ownership levels in historically black neighborhoods were very, very low compared to white neighborhoods because of legal government policies like this that persisted until 1968. It's not until 1968 that the federal government passes a law saying redlining is illegal. But nevertheless, private companies continue to do that less overtly well into the 1970s. As a result of redlining, as a result of government neglect in the city, Jacksonville has a housing crisis. During the 1950s and 1960s, more than 1/3 of Jacksonville's population lived in poverty. And by the early 1960s, 40% of Jacksonville's homes, 40% were deemed substandard. In black neighborhoods in Jacksonville, 75% of homes were deemed substandard by the 1960s. I think that bears just keeping in mind the sheer scope of the problem within the city of Jacksonville. 75% of black homes were deemed substandard by the early 1960s. In black homes, in those very neighborhoods that you saw in in red here, you have homes in neighborhoods that lack sanitation, that lack sewage systems, roads that remained unpaved. I was reading recently about these debates about the stadium deal, and the certain neighborhood groups are saying there are still streets in certain sections of Northwest Jacksonville that remain unpaved. And so again, this was something that the city of Jacksonville deemed a crisis in the 40s and 50s, and we still see the lingering effects of it today. In addition to that, in many of these poorer areas, they were oftentimes located near railroad lines and freight yards. So you had both noise pollution and air pollution there, and as a result of these concentrations of poverty, you also had public health effects. So the housing crisis, in effect, becomes a kind of public health crisis as well, and I'll give you some stats about this too. In the 1960s, respiratory disease was the most common disease in Jacksonville, and tuberculosis deaths for black residents of Jacksonville in the 1950s and 60s were 6 times higher than those of whites. And the tuberculosis death rate for whites in Jacksonville is already high. The death rate for pneumonia and the rate of infant and maternal mortality was twice the rate for black residents, was twice that of what it was for white residents. So the pneumonia death rate and infant and maternal mortality were twice the rate for black residents, was twice what it was for white residents. Just to give you a sense of comparison, today, Jacksonville has an infant mortality rate that is far above the state average. The infant mortality rate in Jacksonville is one of the worst for the city of our size in the nation. And today, the black infant mortality rate is 3.5 times that of the white infant mortality rate. So it's even worse than it was in the 1950s and 1960s. So lest anyone think, again, that these are issues that we can kind of hold back in history, they are very much still with us today. Again, this is an issue that even political leaders in Jacksonville as understood to be entwined issues. I'm going to read you a quote and I'm going to show you a film that was made during the 1950s highlighting this crisis. In the 1950s, this is what the Jacksonville Housing Authority said. The index of a city's vitality is not the height of its office buildings, the width of its superhighways, the depths of its harbor, or the length of its airport runways. The real test of a city's well-being is the quality of its houses. And I think that is an issue that many people are saying, let's keep that in mind when we begin to fund a project to rebuild the stadium. It's a great idea, Jacksonville needs it, but if we neglect the fact that we are not investing in making housing humane, that can we call ourselves a city to take pride in? And this is in a sense what the Jacksonville Housing Authority was arguing in the 1950s. I'll just point out, this was an issue for me growing up that really impacted me because of what my mom did in the 1990s, running a nonprofit known as the Jacksonville Housing Partnership. The Jacksonville Housing Partnership helped homeowners in low-income neighborhoods rehabilitate their homes that were oftentimes in woeful disrepair and who otherwise had no resources and ability to improve their homes, particularly in their older ages. And the Housing Partnership oftentimes did paint the town projects. They did some here at the beach, but particularly in the north and west side in the Pine Forest neighborhood. But being in high school and growing up in Mandarin and going into Northwest Jacksonville, it was seeing a completely another world. It was something that I don't think, even at that age, I could truly comprehend that this was the reality of how particularly older people lived in Jacksonville, Florida in the 1990s. And I had no historical awareness of it. I didn't understand what I saw as a product of history. I think the knee-jerk reaction oftentimes is, well, that's their problem. They made certain choices that led to certain habits, and poverty resulted, and if they could only fix their problems themselves and make better choices, well, this wouldn't be the case. Well, I think looking at history provides a little bit more of a complex picture of the historical roots of this. And for me as a young person, that was certainly eye-opening. And that was in the 1990s. So let me just now show you a film. This is a film that was made in the 1950s about the housing crisis in Jacksonville. And it is showing, it will very clearly show its age. You're on the one hand going to see some rather evocative images of Jacksonville in the 1950s, scenes also of poverty. But the voiceover narration is going to seem to us a little bit patronizing. The problem of housing, according to the narrator, is really not going to be a problem for the people who live in poor housing. The problem of poor housing in Jacksonville is a problem for people who live in better, more well-to-do neighborhoods, because disease could spread and affect those better neighborhoods. Your housemaids will bring those diseases when they leave Northwest Jacksonville and come to Ortega. So don't you want to improve housing so that you, the well-to-do of Jacksonville, don't have to worry about these problems? So just keep that in mind as you listen to this. This is not the most enlightened take on a housing crisis, but the mere fact that this film was made in the 1950s, there is a sense of kind of pricking the collective conscience of the city to see something that most people for years had wanted to look away from.
steps of the State Board of Health building, right across the street. It's well located, isn't it? That temple of public health. Certainly it's convenient to Jacksonville's most serious health menace, though apparently without power to do anything about it. Look at it. Row on row of dilapidated huts. Each of these shacks renting from $18 to $22 a month. Uncomfortable, unsanitary, indecent, and insult to human dignity, spread like an evil cancer through the heart of Jacksonville. Those out. Would you have believed they existed anymore in your city? So many, so ugly. This is the kind of sanitary facility that was outvoted many years ago, condemned as a menace to human life. Certainly a modern city on the threshold of its future is no place to preserve such relics of the dismal past. The price we may have to pay for such filth would be far greater than the cost of eliminating. Just think of it. Most of the roofs on these shanties leak. The walls, which never have been painted, are rotting away. The windows are broken, sealed with cardboard. Yes, it keeps out the rain, but it keeps out the air too. And yet these dwellings cost the occupants as much as they would have to pay in modern, low-cost housing projects with complete sanitary facilities. Jacksonville certainly is a city of contrasts. Duval Park with its fresh green grass and shrubbery is there of confidence, just a few steps from the grimy swamp. But let's move back to Pearl Street, Morris Farm. They're not all Negro farms either. White families are living in similar surroundings here in Jacksonville, but because of the personalities that might be involved, none of them were photographed. Is it possible that there is no hope for recovery from this dread disease? Because this is the way things are now, because human beings live, eat, sleep these wretched shacks, does it follow that this is the way things must remain? Fortunately, it does not. With determination and planning, we can create fresh, vigorous life where formerly was only stagnation, dry rot, decay. It is interesting to observe, for example, that many of Jacksonville's most noxious slums are in the very shadow of the city's finest and tallest new apartment building. A building which itself is embodied of new life and growth, and planted out with creeping, cancerous death below. That fine new structure represents the heart of Jacksonville. It should be, and as it can be, right into the sky, looking to the future.
All right. So that was the slum heart of Jacksonville. There are a couple of other films about housing in the city during the 1940s and 50s. You might have noticed and heard there at the end of the film where they were alluding to the fact that there were white residents who were also living in poverty, but the personalities didn't want to be on camera. That was a way of basically saying we don't want to shame our white residents, but we're more than happy to turn the camera on our poor black residents. But yes, poor housing conditions for poor whites was also an issue in the city, but not nearly on the magnitude and scale as it was for black residents. All right, moving on, the crisis of public education. As I said here at the beginning, in 1964, Jacksonville had 15 of its high schools lose accreditation. And the question is why? Why did that happen? Why was Jacksonville in many ways alone in the state of Florida for its public education crisis? Well, in 1964, Jacksonville ranked 67th out of 67 counties in the state of Florida in terms of per pupil funding. That is dead last, 67 out of 67 in per pupil funding for public education. It was last nationwide among the 20 largest school districts in the nation. Of the top 20, it was 20th in funding for public education in the city. And as was readily known at the time, this was not a question of money, it was a question of political will. And in some sense, it goes back to this decade of progress, the economic and business boom of the 1950s and 1960s. Jim Crooks and other historians have argued that in order to make Jacksonville in the state of Florida a very enticing place to do business and to lure migrants into the area, you need to hold out the carrot stick of low taxes, and that brought them in. And there was an ethos that basically, we are here in Florida, we expect low taxes, and many people said that any tax hike for public education was something they did not tend to support. And so there was widespread resistance to raising taxes to fund public education. In addition to that, there was a problem with collecting property taxes. In Duval Countyans paid far less in property taxes than most other places across the state of Florida, to say nothing of the nation. So you had a very low property tax relative to other cities, which was enticing to bring people into the community, but not great when trying to fund your public schools. In addition to that, because of the homestead exemption law, nearly 2/3 of Jacksonville residents did not pay property taxes during this time at all. And so that was in addition a loss of revenue. So you have a revenue issue here, and that is leading to a whole host of issues in public education. Crumbling facilities, low teacher salaries, which is leading to frequent teacher turnover, teachers having to work multiple jobs, leading to burnout. And all of this, the funding crisis, the teacher pay crisis, the lack of steady employment for teachers, led Jacksonville's high schools to be discredited in 1964. According to a local news editorial, this was the result of, quote, indifference, apathy, and the selfishness of Duval County residents. So even rather conservative newspapers in Jacksonville were calling out local government and particularly local citizens for indifference, apathy, and selfishness. As a result of this, in 1964, and these are photographs I'm going to show here, just talk about them briefly. Old Stanton High School was the historically black high school just to the northwest of downtown. Riverside, what is today Riverside High School, which until a few years ago was Robert E. Lee, was sort of the old one of the many predominantly white high schools in Jacksonville that drew from some of the better neighborhoods in the city, both discredited in 1964. But at Stanton in 1964, as well as other black high schools in 1964, in addition to all the protests I mentioned last week, in December of 1964, there was a massive walkout. 17,000 of Jacksonville's 30,000 black students walked out one day from school in massive protest, not because of Mayor Hayden Burns and his resistance to integration, but because of the neglect of their education, the lack of adequate facilities, of teachers who seemed to care, of adequate textbooks. This was a massive protest that was going on at this time in conjunction with the civil rights movement. Both my mom and my mother-in-law and my grandmother and my father-in-law all graduated from Robert E. Lee. And so again, despite disaccreditation, they managed to do quite well. And Carol, you went to Robert E. Lee as well. Yes, my aunt here, Carol, also went to Robert E. Lee. So the schools could still produce incredible citizens and leaders, but it was a source of shame for the county for a very long time. In fact, it's not until the early 1970s that high schools are accredited once again, and as we'll see next week, it's not until the 1990s that federal courts ruled that Jacksonville's, or I should say Duval County public schools, are officially desegregated. So we've got a housing crisis, we have an environmental crisis, and we have we have an educational crisis, and we have an environmental crisis here in this city during the 1950s and 1960s. This is going hand in hand with the growth of industry in the city, as I'll explain in just a little bit. So some stats to give you a picture. In the 1960s, 15 million gallons of raw sewage was poured into the St. Johns River every single day from city-owned sewer lines. Every single day, 15 million gallons of raw sewage are poured into the St. Johns River from city-owned sewage lines. Companies like the St. Regis Paper Company released 90 million gallons of waste into the river every day. The Alton Box Company added an additional 15 million gallons, and I'm just giving you a few of these particular companies here. As I said, what had once been one of the richest coastal ecosystems really in the world, if you kind of talk about this up to the development of Jacksonville, by the 1960s had become somewhat unfit for life, certainly for swimming, although I understand that some people nevertheless did. Phyllis, my mom, I believe, were in the St. Johns River during that time, but are still among us today, so it wasn't that bad. In addition to that, during the 1950s and 60s, Jacksonville had one of the worst air pollution problems in America. And really the first hints of this we saw in the late 1940s when Jacksonville made national news for a bizarre problem that was affecting women who were walking downtown. And that is, women walking downtown suddenly realized that their nylon stockings were dissolving on their legs. As they walked downtown, they would feel a tingling in their legs, and some women would look down and see massive runs. And obviously, this made good copy and was picked up all across the country. But what was going on here? Well, this was sulfuric acid that was trapped in the air, particularly during winter days when the pattern led to a temperature inversion, in which, in effect, there was not a lot of air moving, and that sulfuric acid droplets hung in the air from those new plants that were everywhere in Jacksonville, and the effects were that they were beginning to dissolve the hose worn by women. Well, that doesn't go away. It continues into the 1950s, but it is overshadowed by massive amounts of new pollution. And I'm going to go back actually to the Owens, here I am. The Owens, Illinois mill here that spewed a lot of air pollution that made its way into the East Side and Talleyrand neighborhoods. During the 1950s and 1960s, it was very common for people's cars, the metal in people's cars, to be corroded, the paint on their homes to be discolored. For many homes, particularly in poor white and black neighborhoods where you did not have central heat and air, and where you had to have the windows open, that corrosion took place within the house as well. Air particles, dirt, soot from these plants oftentimes accumulated inside homes, and the disintegration of nylon stockings for people who lived close to these plants continued. This, much like the housing crisis, clearly was going to lead to a public health crisis. And as I said, respiratory diseases by the 1960s were the most common diseases in Jacksonville. And Jacksonville had a lung cancer rate that was much higher than the national average. And my mother-in-law, Phyllis Towsey, did studies on this. And now, Phyllis, if I recall, what y'all were focused mostly on the effects of can you remind everybody the study you did and what you learned about Jacksonville?
We did the study because a very forward-thinking person, a very forward-thinking person named Alberta Hibbs at St. Vincent's read that we had the leading rate of lung cancer death in the nation, and she had the power to do this, so she got a National Cancer Institute epidemiologist to come here to study this problem, and I was just the luckiest person on earth who was there with that right kind of degree, and I got to work with them on it.
Yeah.
We did publish results, but I don't know how much you want to know.
Oh yeah, but was it?
It became linked to our high smoking rate.
Mm-hmm.
We had an unusually high smoking rate. I mean, people that smoke, not more people smoked, but people who smoked enormous rates, enormous amounts of cigarettes a day. And so it threw us into a very high lung cancer.
Didn't shipbuilding play?
Shipbuilding was the first thing. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, shipbuilding had exposed a lot of people here to asbestos. And so that was a major cause of our lung cancer outbreak. and then the high smoking. But the air quality, which was really a major working hypothesis, did not prove, it could not be proved, let's put it that way. It's very difficult to prove a link between a section of town's air quality and the development of a number of lung cancer cases there. So we didn't prove anything on that.
Thank you, Phyllis. So there was no direct causal relationship between air quality and lung cancer, but there was with other respiratory diseases. Childhood asthma was particularly an issue that was noted. And in fact, this was an issue that got many people, particularly women, involved in Jacksonville during the 1960s. I'm going to talk more about Mimi Adams next week when we talk about all the wonderful things people were doing to make Jacksonville a better place in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. But Mimi Adams was from sort of the aristocracy of Jacksonville, so to speak. And her children suffered from asthma. One of her close friends lost a child to asthma, and they tended to believe that it was a result of Jacksonville's awful air quality. So Mimi Adams took this crusade on in the 1960s to expose the problem of Jacksonville's terrible air quality and to force local government to begin to pass policies to rectify it. She would eventually, as I'll go into more detail next week, testify in Jacksonville in 1969. In 1969, there was a U.S. Senate subcommittee hearing in Jacksonville that was a part of what will eventually become the Clean Air and Water Acts, major environmental legislation that was passed during the Nixon administration. And Mimi Adams will testify before a U.S. Senator here in Jacksonville talking about its air quality problems. But what she basically reveals is that Jacksonville had the highest rate of sulfuric acid in its air of any city in the United States, other than the unfortunately named Sulphur City, Texas. So aside from a city named Sulphur City, we had the most sulfuric acid in our air. And Mimi Adams basically said, now, this is, yes, a result of Jacksonville's booming industrial economy, but this is also a byproduct of a lack of political will, of apathy, of indifference. And we've seen that as a kind of common thread here in these other topics. And this is what Adams said before the Senate committee. Our population owes it to itself to become enlightened on such issues as air pollution, so that at election time, such men of courage will fill the positions of leadership in our government. If these positions are filled by the puppets of selfish lobbies, our country shall return to the dark ages. What Mimi Adams discovered is that one of the main polluters in Jacksonville were not just private companies like the Alton Box Company, but were instead actually city-run electric plants. And the fact that Mimi Adams said we are one of the worst polluters is because the city has this sweetheart deal with an oil salesman who they have purchased from for the past 60 years, and they sell him terrible oil at a very low price. And so they just continue to buy oil from this dealer without any competitive bids from any other oil producer. And so as a result, because the city wants to save money and keep its relationship with this oil company, we're going to buy low-grade oil that results in terrible air quality. And Mimi Adams called out that kind of good old boy network. At the very time, this was just one example of kind of city corruption that was going on that's going to lead to consolidation. So Mimi Adams is just a sort of a preview of some people we'll talk about next week who were doing remarkable things. And here's one of the city electric generating plants in the 1950s that Mimi Adams identified as the main culprit in our city's environmental and public health crisis. All right, I'm going to conclude now with a brief snapshot of corruption. I'm going to make this very quick because A, we're nearing our end, and then B, I want to really dive into consolidation next week. And so to understand consolidation, you have to understand the corruption that was going on in the city in addition to all these other crises. I promise we will get to the really good things that do eventually happen in the city, but you have to go through corruption first. In 1966, a grand jury was convened after a local television station, WJXT, did a series of stories revealing malfeasance and other examples of corruption in city government. And the grand jury found, amongst other things, these examples of corruption in the city. Jacksonville City Commissioners gave out insurance contracts to friends and political allies without regard to cost, coverage, or need. Jacksonville City Councilmen were indicted on grand larceny, conspiracy, and perjury charges. Jacksonville City officials purchased 170 cars at top price over a 5-year period without, again, competitive bids, and then proceeded to use those cars for private reasons as well as public purposes. A Jacksonville City Commissioner resigned after it was discovered that he used city funds to pay for labor and materials to work on his home. Jacksonville's president of the city council was charged with stealing $10,000 from the city. The grand jury said this: "We want to make it clear we are not criticizing a simple mistake or error in human judgment. We are condemning a calculated course of conduct, indulged in by city officials with the apparent full knowledge that it was contrary to the best interest of the taxpayers and citizens. When elected officials use their positions and power to enrich their friends and political allies at wasteful public expense, they abuse their power and lessen the public trust reposed to them." The grand jury's ultimate recommendation: we recommend a revision of the government and structure of the city of Jacksonville. That is how grave the situation had gotten in Jacksonville. The grand jury is saying, scrap it all and begin again. So that's where we're going to pick up next week. The idealism of consolidation, hoping to remake government, address all of these crises in the city. We will see that it does some of that. But as I said at the beginning, it will not achieve all of its promises. A lot of these issues will remain unresolved and are ones that I think is important for us to recognize that are still going on and affect other people throughout the city. Thank you all very much. Yes, I'm happy to answer questions if anybody. Sorry, yeah, thank you, Donna. Yes. Brian.
When did the Navy establish its presence in Jacksonville?
So the important part of that story of growth is during World War II, but particularly about 1940 and 41 is when we see Mayport, NAS Jackson, Cecil Field come in basically online, so to speak. And so it is for the United States, during very early in the war, even before we are actually at war, we already have those naval bases established.
Before consolidation, those would have been outside the city, right?
Yes, so NAS Jax would have been right on the southern fringe of the city line. Cecil Field would have been well to the west beyond the city line, and Mayport would have been, yeah. But that is important because, of course, not only are people here moving to the city during World War II, but World War II exacerbates a housing crisis because a lot of the servicemen remain in Jacksonville, or those who leave the service after the war actually loved living in Northeast Florida, particularly Northerners who said, wow, the weather here is beautiful, there's a river and there's a beach, all the reasons why people move here to this very day. And so they came back to Northeast Florida afterwards. And that meant, okay, well, where are they going to live? The GI Bill was, of course, in effect. And so despite that government money, there was simply a housing shortage, and you could not make homes fast enough. And they were all being built out in the county, which was facilitating that white flight process. Yes?
People might find this interesting.
Yes.
I lived through all that stuff. And I worked for lawyers downtown in the old part of Townsville. It's represented Barney Cobb. That's the name you're familiar with, I'm sure.
Barn-
Commissioners.
Yeah.
And he said to me, I was raised, I scratch your back and you scratch mine.
Right.
And that's the way contracts were given out.
Yes. If y'all couldn't, here, in fact, I'll bring the microphone to you, so. I know, this is what you get for speaking up.
I'm sorry.
No.
I always speak up.
Absolutely.
I was experiencing all of this as it happened, and I worked for lawyers downtown in the old Bartertown building, which doesn't even exist anymore. But we represented one of these city commissioners, Barney Cobb, who was one of the ones indicted. And he said to me,
I was raised that I scratch your back and you scratch mine. And that's how all the contracts were
Yep.
awarded.
Yeah, Jacksonville into the 1980s, and you will still hear people use the phrase the good old boy system. That's in effect what this was, and the city's had a really hard time shaking that reputation. Again, we won't get too much into more recent politics, to whether or not that's still going on, but that certainly was the perception. And you saw it. You saw it in nearly every phase of life. I mean, in some sense, that system explains the neglects that we've seen with public education. It explains the neglect that we saw with housing, particularly with the environment. When Mimi Adams reveals the fact that they basically were just buying terrible oil because they had the sweetheart deal from a business they had been operating with for 60 years. It was the quintessential back-scratching relationship. And so the effects of that, and I think that's what the grand jury was basically saying here. We need a government that considers the well-being of the people and not just its own power and enrichment, so to speak. Other questions? All right, well, thank you very much, and I'll look forward to seeing you again next week. No,